I'm Cornell Clayton, director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out today. Let me remind you, this is part of our ongoing series on the future of liberal democracy. Our next event in that series will be in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from today, November 6th. We have Samuel Moyn from Yale coming out, and he'll be talking about liberalism's lost aspirations, which is really about what happened to liberalism during the Cold War, and also to some extent what happens once the Cold War is over. So it should be a very interesting talk as well. Today we're fortunate to have with us Matthew McManus, who's an assistant professor at Spelman College. He received his PhD from York University in Toronto, and before going to Spelman, he taught at the University of Michigan and also at Whitman College just down the street here, although he says he wasn't just down the street, that was during the pandemic, so he was online during it. Matt is a prolific author and has published over a dozen books, numerous articles in the major journals of political theory and social thought. Among his most recent works are The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, which was published by Rutledge just last year, and then 2 other books that will be the subject of his remarks today: The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and The Political Right and Equality, published by Rutledge in 2023. Join me now in welcoming Matt McManus to the Foley.
Yeah. Well, it's really great to be here. I'm actually quite jealous of all of you since I'm a big fan of Sam Moyn's work. So I wish I could be here for that talk. So I know that the most interesting part of all these discussions are the comments that are phrased as questions. So I'm going to be relatively quick. Although if I do speak too quickly, the way that my wife says that I do, please ensure to interrupt me. So my presentation is going to talk about the 2 prongs of my research, at least as it's been for the last couple of years. The first is going to cover the ascendancy of illiberal politics, mainly from an intellectual standpoint, since I'm a political theorist, that's what I do, and the threat that I see these liberal forces posing to democracy. And then the second is going to show how liberals, socialists, and liberal socialists can respond to this challenge. Once upon a time, this is a bit more of a theoretical project, but since it looks like Zoran Mamdani is going to be the mayor of New York, there's actually a little bit of practical resonance to it now, which is certainly nice from my political standpoint. So shameless plug for the books if you want to get them. So at the turn of the 20th century, intelligent commentators hypothesized that we'd reach the end of history in Francis Fukuyama's famous phrase. Now, Fukuyama was never quite the shill for neoliberalism that people took him to be. In fact, as he repeatedly likes to point out, he actually predicted in his book on the end of history that people like Donald Trump might decide to bring history back because they had this need for thymotic recognition. But certainly many intelligent commentators said the reality is that liberal capitalism had defeated its fascist enemies on the far right during the Second World War, and its communist enemies on the far left during the Cold War. And a lot of liberal intellectuals even like to conflate the 2 together, talking about how the open society had confronted various forms of closed societies, or collectivism had defeated, individualism had defeated collectivism. You get the idea. This left liberal capitalism with no serious rivals left on the geopolitical scene, ensuring its ideological supremacy, as some thought, not just for the moment, but potentially forever. And even socialist and Marxist critics on the left seem to concede this. Slavoj Žižek, who some of you might know, in the 1990s, never tired of saying everyone had become a closet Fukuyamist, right? It didn't matter how many radical feminist critiques he wrote. Deep down, everyone kind of believed that liberal democracy was here to stay. There was no changing it. So it turned out that the end of history lasted about 25 years or so, right? So about the length of a couple of pop culture cycles. The end of history for many in the Western world. There are different people who periodized it. As a millennial, I usually like to point to 2008, when many of my peers saw our lives crashing down. But most people now seem to be dating it to 2016, which is the year the Brexit vote happened, as some of you remember. And of course, Donald Trump was elected to the most powerful office in the world for the first time, as it turns out. By 2018, many of the most powerful and notable countries in the world, the USA, India, Russia, Brazil, had illiberal leaders, self-described, and many other fellow travelers or notable states like Hungary, Poland, Britain, etc., all seem to also be moving in this direction. After Trump and Bolsonaro's defeats in 2020 and 2022, some predicted that we'd weathered the storm, that this turned out to just be a kind of weird blip on the radar, right? One of my colleagues said it's almost like everyone had a night of heavy drinking, decided to just flirt a little bit with some light fascism, then woke up the next day and said, boy, that was a bad idea, never again, right? But it turned out we were just in the eye of the hurricane because we all know, of course, who's in office right now. So among these remarkable and disturbing developments has been the resurgence of post and transparently illiberal thinking on what Edmund Fawcett calls the hard right. For those of you who don't know Edmund Fawcett, he's a writer for The Economist, kind of a left liberal guy. This is from his really great book, Conservatism, The Fight for Tradition. He says it doesn't really even make sense to talk about the far right any longer. Instead, we should be talking about the hard right. And the reason for this, he says, is talking about people as being on the far right suggests that they're kind of beyond the Overton window, right? They're people like, say, Sam Francis back in the 1990s, right? They publish in obscure little journals agitating for things like white nationalism, but nobody serious pays attention to them. Well, now we have people like Stephen Miller in the White House, right? So clearly these are not far right groups any longer. They're hard right in the sense that they reject basic liberal norms, but are certainly in position to advance their own ideological agenda. So I'm going to very briefly talk about some of the anti-liberal and hard right intellectuals and authors that have appeared on the American, mostly American political spectrum, and try to describe their aspirations and their outlook. And I want to point out from the get-go, right? Many people have a pretty homologous understanding of right-wing thought. That includes a lot of leftists and Marxists, right? I would actually say that in many ways the political right is a more diverse space than what you find amongst liberal and even left-wing circles. People there have a lot of different ideas, some quite strange about any number of different things. But what unites them all is their conviction, as the national conservative Yoram Hazony once put it in a tweet, that liberalism destroys everything. It is just a fundamentally corrosive force, and it needs to go, the way the Marvel movies are going. So beyond their conviction that liberalism rules everything, there are deep divides amongst right-wing intellectuals, movers and shakers about what it is that they want. And they're also tonally quite diverse, right? Anybody who goes online will know if you look at Patrick Deneen or Yoram Hazony and how they approach the world, it's very different than people like Raj, Nationalist, or Lomez, or Curtis Yarvin, right? Even though these all share conceptual space. By and large, Yoram Hazony, Deneen, and others aim for a more respectable kind of a liberal conservatism. And this is also associated typically with their politics. Hazony and Deneen will typically say they're not necessarily anti-democracy, they're just anti-liberal democracy, right? In fact, if anything, they think that a conservative form of democracy would be more democratic than its liberal alternative. They do all make clear, however, that an aristopopulism or anti-egalitarian national conservatism or post-liberalism needs to replace liberal elites, and that this aristopopulist elite will be far less concerned with using state power to advance hard right goals. And these groups have models to build off of. That's one of the important things to note as well, right? Policymakers like Ron DeSantis, J.D. Vance, and the Heritage Foundation have all drank... I apologize. I knew that would happen. Have all drank deeply of these wells, and usually they point to soft authoritarian regimes like Hungary as a model to follow, right? Some others will point to Singapore, but you get the drift, right? Hungary is definitely the kind of paradigm that they like. So in her recent book for Princeton University Press, Furious Minds, Laura Field, who's the director of the Illiberalism Studies Institute, discusses the different factions of the hard right in considerable detail, running through how exactly they reject liberal values. And if you haven't read that book yet, I really recommend you pick it up. It's probably the best guide to MAGA intellectuals out there. So just very briefly, national conservatives like Hazony endorsed what he calls a conservative democracy, which is going to be a democracy where what he takes to be the dominant ethno-religious group or groups are entitled to use the state to impose a homogenizing and anti-egalitarian moral order. Very briefly, and this is from his book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery, and his other book, The Virtue of Nationalism. This includes restricting immigration, demanding conformity to the national and religious culture and its mores, emphatically rejecting international law, right? Hazony is absolutely insistent that international law doesn't really have much of any place in governing the affairs of the nation, and prioritizing at a moral level the needs of the ethno-religious group over a kind of commitment to cosmopolitan universalism, of the sort that he sees as being central to to liberalism. Groups like LGBTQ individuals or religious minorities might be entitled to what he calls a carve-out from the expectation that they're going to conform to dominant religious mores. But what's really notable about this carve-out is it's not a matter of right. You know, if you're an LGBTQ person, you don't have a right to practice your lifestyle. If you're a religious minority, you don't have a right to practice your religion. It's entirely at the discretion of the dominant group. Right? They get to decide who gets these carve-outs and why. And notably, they're not going to be particularly expansive carve-outs. So what Field calls the Claremonters, aka Michael Anton and Larry Arnn, are probably more marginal, but still significant intellectuals. And these figures tend to draw on right-wing versions of Straussianism to argue that American culture is now defined by a loss of manliness and the classical virtues that they associate with this. They often criticize society for an excessive effeminacy, losing touch with traditional aspirations for greatness. And aligned with this, there's a deep concern about a lack of deference that people now pay to the intellectual and spiritual betters of society. So it's, again, a very kind of masculist ethos. And if you want a good example of this, I'd encourage you all to read Michael Anton's famous United 93 election. You all know what the United 93 flight was, right? Okay. Well, Anton basically calls 2016 a United 93 election because he says it's the last chance for conservatives to fight against this corrosive liberalism that he associated at that point with Hillary Clinton. And he said, yeah, Donald Trump is a flawed vehicle for enacting a virtuous set of policies. Go figure, right? But nonetheless, we kind of get behind that. Finally, there are the post-liberals who constitute the most diverse and, I have to say, intellectually astute group in the MAGA universe. And it includes academics like Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeulen from Harvard Law. And by and large, these post-liberals are committed to a kind of right-wing Catholicism. I say right-wing Catholicism because there very much is a kind of left Catholic movement in this country that's important to distinguish them from. One could even make the claim that the Pope isn't exactly in line with the post-liberal program right now, right? By and large, the post-liberals overlap with the national conservatives perhaps most closely, but they tend to accept a more universalistic ethic than what national conservatives advocate for, which of course is intrinsic to their Catholicism, right? It's very hard to be a Catholic and say, we are entitled to prioritize the needs of the nation over the needs of all the rest of humanity. However, they do insist that the country needs to replace its liberal elite with a new conservative elite. And people like Deneen insist that they shouldn't be afraid to use the state to induce Christian virtue or respect for Christian virtue. And it's also worth noting that the post-liberals are quite notably willing to embrace a kind of counter-revolutionary rhetoric, right? The title of Deneen's last book was Regime Change, and that tells you a lot of what you want to know, right? They're not really in the business of conserving any longer because they feel that liberal democracy has left not much that's worth conserving any longer. So this is from Adrian Vermeulen at Harvard Law. His essay, All Human Conflict is Ultimately Theological. That'll give you a bit of a sense of the flavor of some of this post-liberal rhetoric and why it is that they hold liberalism in contempt. So he says that Schmidt and Francis in their different registers, he's talking about Carl Schmitt there, the Nazi jurist, an author of political theology, in different registers suggest the problem I want to identify and discuss here. The relentless dynamic of liberalism tends to undermine the peace, security, and order that liberalism itself promises. What liberalism cannot obey are the natural principles, or if you like, natural laws of political rule that go under the label of ragion di Stato, principles and laws that no ruler can defy without undermining the very conditions of his rule. Minds more powerful than my own have argued that liberalism, in one way or another, undermines itself. The mechanisms proposed to this end are numerous and various. My project is to add one such mechanism whose claim to consideration is that it captures the distinctive nature of sacramental liberalism, an essentially religious movement and set of commitments with a distinctive soteriology, eschatology, and ecclesiology. To the extent this mechanism has been overlooked, it is because earlier theorists were oblivious to the categories of constitutional and political theology, to the theological and liturgical dimensions of liberalism, and to Cardinal Maddening's dictum, all human conflict is ultimately theological. Okay. Now, this is a pretty hoity way of basically Vermeulen saying, the reality is that liberalism doesn't have any special claim to be more rational, let alone to have a better understanding of the world. People have made a theological choice for a liberal outlook in the United States for a very long time, but it's purely a choice. And he thinks, of course, we should make a different choice for a more Catholic, integralist approach to not only policy, but also law, right? In his book, Common Good Constitutionalism, he gives us a bit of a look at what this would look like. And Vermeulen is more emphatic than Deneen in saying things like democracy is an instrumental good, not a necessary good, right? If people make the right choice for virtue, then their choices can be respected. If not, then there's no reason that a conservative court can't overturn democratic majorities if they move into a liberal direction. This is from Field's book. For those of you who are interested, I think I sent the slides to everyone. It's a really great kind of map of MAGA intellectuals and what they're doing. And again, I cannot emphasize it enough. Go pick it up. Hopefully she'll send me a check for all the publicity. And unfortunately, I have to point out that the national cons, Claremonters, and post-liberals are far from the most sinister stuff that the hard right has to offer, since these are the more mainstream intellectuals that now appear in the MAGA universe. What's been quite notable, certainly over the last 5 years or so, has been the rise of much more transparently anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and ultimately fascist kind of thinkers on the MAGA right. Many of these are influenced by authors of the German conservative revolution. This is a 20th century, early 20th century movement of German intellectuals, including Schmidt, Junger, and Heidegger, all of whom essentially said the Weimar Republic is a corrupt, liberal, socialist institution, far too friendly to things like feminism, and it needs to be undone, not by a return to the old imperial German system, but by a new movement from the right that's going to excite people in a way that previous conservatism wasn't able to. And not surprisingly, many of these authors either sympathized with fascism when it appeared or outright signed on to it. So there are a lot of different names for these intellectuals. Again, Field refers to this as the hard right underbelly of Magadam. You've also seen them referred to by me as the Nietzschean right, or people like Michael Lind have referred to them as the eugenicons because of their fascination with things like race, eugenics, etc. So these authors and influencers include people, get ready because there are going to be some fun names here, like Tucker Carlson, not so much of a fun one, but Bronze Age perverts, Lomez, Rayek nationalist, who seems to be really gaining in preeminence, and once upon a time, Richard Hanania, although he seems to have moved pretty firmly into the liberal camp recently. All of these are figures who openly endorse racist and eugenic ideas, and who are willing to transparently flirt with fascism. Not even, what a liberal would think fascism is, just outright fascism, right? In fact, Bronze Age Pervert in a 2021 essay said, I am a fascist or something worse, right? And the reason is he thought that fascism was too democratic for his taste, right? It still had this kind of populist, volkish quality to it, and that's not really palatable for someone like Costin, right? Then there are more overt authoritarians like Curtis Yarvin or Peter Thiel, who argue that essentially any concession with democracy was a mistake. Some of you might know Marvin Mencius-Moldbug. He's been previewed very recently in the New Yorker, the New York Times, everywhere. His famous argument is that where normal conservatives are angry about the civil rights movement and real conservatives are angry at the French Revolution, Yarvin is still angry about the English Civil Wars, right? He thinks that that was a mistake, right? We need to go back to Robert Filmer and all those figures. Thiel, as some of you might know, is a multi-billionaire who's financed an enormous number of these figures. Probably the most notable work of his is I believe it was a 2009, might be 2008 essay, The Education of a Libertarian, where he says, I've come to realize from a libertarian, quote unquote, perspective that democracy was a mistake because too many poor people and women especially have been allowed to participate in politics, and poor people and women by and large tend to vote for Barack Obama or people like him. This is a violation of liberty, and so we need to undo that, right? So much the worse for democracy. And again, once upon a time, it'd be pretty easy to dismiss these people the way that someone like, say, for Sam Francis, for those of you who know, was dismissed. But they've had a huge influence on J.D. Vance, who's kind of at the nexus of a lot of these streams of thought. Chris Rufo, Josh Hawley, all of these figures have flirted with the kind of masculist, ethno-chauvinist, so-called counter-revolutionary rhetoric that these figures offer, right? I'm not moving too fast, am I?
Yes.
I'll try to go a little slower still. So this is a pretty grim picture of the post-liberal future that these figures want for us, at least for those of us who are committed or remain committed to the principles of liberty, equality, and solidarity for all. My contention in the more constructive program of my work is that many liberals have failed to reflect very deeply on what has led us to this point, which would require bluntly acknowledging that the forms of neoliberal hegemony that were dominant in liberal circles at the turn of the century largely deserve to fail, right? My kind of pithy statement is that neoliberalism was uninspired in theory and has proven largely a failure in practice, producing societies characterized by intense inequalities of wealth and opportunities. And these intense inequalities of wealth and opportunities come to be aligned with inequities of economic and political power that serve to delegitimate liberal democracy in the minds of many citizens for very good reasons, right? To paraphrase Alistair McIntyre in his last book, Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, this is an outcome somebody like Marx would have predicted and warned us against had we not had to learn the lessons he had to teach again and again. So just to kind of give you a sense of the flavor of some of this to kind of back up what I'm saying, it's not just speculative. Empirical studies by conservative social scientists like Eatwell and Goodwill stated that one of the reasons why people embraced right-wing populist movements was the perception that liberal and especially neoliberal elites were out of touch, cosmopolitan, and concerned with the interests of the rich rather than the interests of ordinary citizens. And the sad truth is that further studies by people like Thomas Piketty or moderate liberals like Gillen's all demonstrate that this perception is correct, right? By any metric, ordinary citizens have had very little say in the laws that govern them, certainly in the United States for a very long time, right? Gillen's in particular in Affluence and Influence is particularly ruthless, right? Where he says, it'd be very hard to call America a democracy post-1980. It's far better to call it a plutocracy, because even though people were allowed to vote, didn't really matter which party was in power. People who got their way were the rich, almost every time. Whether Barack Obama was in power, George Bush, you name it. Those are the policies that were advanced. Okay? So this perception that liberal political elites and institutions are unresponsive to the needs of ordinary citizens obviously plays an enormous role in delegitimating liberal democracy. And I would also add, and this is where my work on postmodern conservatism comes in, plays a role in inducing an attitude of cynicism towards politics that really opens the ground for someone like Donald Trump to gain a lot of power and influence. Because Trump, as dishonest as he is often very plausible when he calls out corruption or says everything I've done, they've done as well, right? I'm just a lot more transparent and a lot more transactional about that, right? People, by and large, tend to prefer an honest bullshitter over someone who pretends to be above all that and then actually was just going to call up the plutocrats and say, we're going to give you whatever it is that you want. Right? So in his book, Liberalism Against Itself, Samuel Moyn, who's been an enormous influence on my work, which again is why I'm very jealous I'm not going to be here to say hi to him next week, he stresses how this was not by accident, but by design, right? Cold War neoliberals, as he refers to them, largely turned away from the early aspirations of liberalism to secure societies of liberty, equality, and solidarity for all, not just for the wealthy, and embraced instead a liberalism that was characterized by enormous amounts of caution and fear, including fears of socialism, certainly, but also excess democracy. Right? There was a concern that the swinish multitude, if they were given too much of a say in how they were governed, might be potentially dangerous in terms of their attitudes towards things like private property, who actually calls the shots, that kind of thing. We can't have that, right? And Moyn points out that the irony is that this kind of conservative or a cautious crouch that liberals took ended up being perhaps the least sensible thing that they could have ended up doing, because it delegitimated liberal democracy in the eyes of a lot of people. And at the close of his great book, Moyn warns that if liberals don't find a way to restore a sense of hope, it's unlikely that we're going to see our creed survive into the 21st century. And in my favorite phrase of his, he says, the reality is also survival isn't good enough. Right? You don't just want to have people like Joe Biden elected into office to sputter out a couple of years, only for right-wing populists to come in immediately afterwards, because people think, well, nothing really fundamental has changed, right? Same old with the Democratic Party. So this is where I come to my more recent book, right? In my book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, I draw on Moyn, C.B. Macpherson, John Stuart Mill, and John Rawls, and a variety of others, to argue for retrieving a tradition of liberal socialist thought that I argue can provide a sense of hope in these difficult times. Now, I always like to joke that when I announced that I was going to be writing this book, I very briefly united libertarians and Marxists on the internet together and saying, that's a ridiculous idea, get out of here, right? It's completely oxymoronic, right? And one of the reasons why I think this is true is that for many who've been weaned on Cold War liberalism, the idea of anything like liberal socialism might very well seem like an oxymoron, right? It's just never going to happen, right? But as I point out, it's really telling that the two most significant liberal philosophers, not of one but 2 centuries, Mill and Rawls, both argued for a form of liberal socialism or were extremely sympathetic towards it. Mill famously said that socialists were the more far-sighted successors of liberalism, and more or less intended to do the same thing, just in the life of poor people, right? And Rawls said something very similar. And I think that there's really something to this, in the sense that both liberalism and socialism share a lot more in common with one another than they ever have with the right. And I'm not talking about the liberal right, I mean the real right, the kind of people that I'm talking about before. In the sense of being mature Enlightenment doctrines, by and large committed to the idea that liberty, equality, and solidarity for all are the right principles for a society. So in my book, and if you're going to the grad seminar also afterwards, I go into this in a lot more detail, a lot more boring detail, really. I argue liberal socialists are committed to three core principles, although naturally these are all understood very differently by all the people I talk about in my book. Right? So I talk about Tom Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, Chantal Mouffe, a whole lot of them. Right? They all understand this differently. So I argue the first principle is a commitment to methodological collectivism and normative individualism. The second principle is a commitment to a developmental rather than acquisitive ethic. And then the third, and here's some really fun Rawlsian language for you. Liberal socialists are committed to a basic social structure with highly participatory liberal democratic political institutions and protection for liberal rights. What's notable, though, is that liberal socialists call for the extension of liberal and democratic principles into the workplace and the economy. And certainly all feminist liberal socialists, which quite a lot of them, would also say these principles need to be extended to the family as well. Right? Notably somebody like Mouffe or Mill, very, very prominent feminists. So we'll go through this very quickly. In the book, I argue that liberal socialists are methodological collectivists and normative individualists, which is not a point original to me. I shamelessly steal it from Tony Smith in his great book, Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism. What Smith points out is that liberal egalitarians, as they call them, and I would say liberal socialists fall into this, accept the need to understand human beings as social animals who can only flourish when they are embedded in the right communal practices and the right institutions. And this is a point that goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? Man is a social animal. Anyone who is not a social animal is either a beast or a god, right? I don't do too many gods, or at least haven't met too many in my time, right? However, liberal socialists are normative individualists in the sense that they think it is the concrete well-being of individuals, future generations, and potentially non-human animals which are of moral concern. Or if you want to use Derek Parfit's term, they're what matters from a moral point of view. Why is this important? Because all liberal socialists would say reified abstractions or imagined communities like the nation or the people or the faith, it's not that they're unimportant, right? Just because they're kind of imagined communities doesn't mean they're insignificant, but they're only of derivative moral concern, which means you can't prioritize the needs of the nation over the needs of the actual people who make it up. It's certainly not the minorities that make it up. Right? So secondly, liberal socialists reject what Macpherson calls the possessive individualist ethic that holds that human beings should be understood as atomized competitive animals who are primarily motivated by the gratification of their hedonic desires, right? Basically, we're all in competition with one another to get as much stuff as possible for as long as possible, and then we die and we hope that our children will be able to do the same. That's kind of Macpherson's telling, right? Now, Macpherson points out, obviously this is accurate to an extent, right? All you need to do is spend any time, looking at people tweet about, from Wall Street, and you'll know that there are definitely hyper-competitive, hyper-acquisitive people out there, right? But this misses, according to liberal socialists, the different and richer ways in which flourishing and happiness are achieved. So liberal socialists, by and large, reject an acquisitive ethic that holds that acquiring material goods and using them to gratify desires is the basis of flourishing, for one that stresses the development and exercise of our higher capacities, especially the highest kinds of capacities, and they suggest that is what is of enduring ethical value. And a good example of this would be John Stuart Mill, right? Mill famously said, it's wrong to understand human beings as basically just little pigs waiting to be satisfied, right? We're much more like living trees that want to grow and extend ourselves on all ends. And in order to grow and extend ourselves on all ends as living trees, we need to have our fundamental capacities developed to the extent possible. And Mill also notably said this will require other people as well, right? We can't become fully rounded without forming beneficial relations with others. And I point out in my book, this is not fundamentally different from what Marx understood good society to be as well, right? In Capital Volume 3, Marx famously said, the goal of socialism should be a society where the end of social policy is the development of human powers as a goal in and of itself. So then finally, I say liberal socialists argue that a just basic structure is one with highly participatory liberal democratic institutions and strong protection for liberal rights. Okay? Now, notably, the kind of socialist element of this is that basic rights do not include a right to expansive ownership of the means of production, or what Will Edmondson calls the commanding heights of the economy. Okay? But Rawls would point out that any kind of good liberal socialist society would need to emulate the Nordic states in providing strong protections for personal property. And this is where you get into some tricky empirical questions, where people say, well, what's the difference between private ownership of the means of production and ownership of personal property. And I don't really think that there's a good theoretical way of settling it. I think that this is a penumbral case that has to be settled in also part by examining it on a one-by-one basis, right? But basically, if you run a small business, I don't think that anyone has a problem with that. If you own a massive business and you don't want to let your workers unionize, that's a bigger problem, right? So liberal socialists also argue that certainly in the larger forms of economic life, liberal rights need to be extended organically into the economy and the family to protect against domination and subordination. So a very good book on this recently is by Liz Anderson at the University of Michigan in her book, Private Government. And just very briefly, she says, if you were to tell the average American, from now on, the government is going to tell you when you can go to the bathroom, when you're going to wake up, what you're going to say, who you're going to be friends with, what you're going to wear, there'd probably be a revolution tomorrow, right? Everybody would be saying, don't tread on me. There'd be another Boston Tea Party. You get the idea. But we're all very comfortable if people in the workplace or our bosses tell us to do exactly the same things. And what Anderson points out is most of us will probably spend 33 to 35 years of our life at work, right? And then when you take into account that we all have to sleep sometime, right? Actually, in many ways, our place of work has a far bigger impact on the structure of our life than our relation to the state. And she points out, consequently, why wouldn't we want to extend things like rights to freedom of assembly, rights to freedom of expression, a certain amount of democracy into the workplace, given the impact that it has on us, right? So usually this is understood to entail at a broader level a commitment to a kind of market socialism, where workers would by and large own the means of production alongside some forms of nationalized industry. And of course, it would be accompanied by an expansively redistributive welfare state. Okay? And I usually point to the Nordic model as something that's worth emulating here. I went on tour with Pelle Dragstedt, who wrote a good book called Nordic Socialism, if you're interested, talking about the Danish experience with just these kinds of approaches. And Denmark, I just saw, had the second highest quality of life in the world, right? So they must be doing something right. So just to give an example of who I'm talking about, John Stuart Mill, right? John Stuart Mill is most famous for his stirring defense of personal freedom and On Liberty. And I would add, since this is often forgotten and it shouldn't be, his all equally stirring defense of women's equality and the subjection of women, deeply inspired by his relationship with his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, I should say, right, with whom he had nothing but praise. So Mill held that the goal of life should be to ensure individuals are free and capable to develop their individual personality, once again, like a living tree that must evolve and grow to its natural extent. Less well known is the fact that Mill, alongside his wife Harriet Taylor, came to identify him with a form of cooperativist and market socialism, and even overtly identified as a socialist in his mature period when he wrote his greatest works. And this has produced some very interesting books in recent years for those of you who like the literature. Probably the best book on this subject is by Helen McCabe at the University of Nottingham, John Stuart Mill, Socialist. And there's also Liz Anderson's recent book, Hijacked, about the neoliberal work ethic and why Mill would have hated it. Worth looking at also. So this is from Mill's autobiography, where he kind of gives an account of his transition. He says, our ideal of ultimate improvement went far beyond democracy and would class us decidedly under the general designation of socialists. While we repudiated with the greatest energy that tyranny of society over the individual, which most socialistic systems are supposed to involve, we yet look forward to a time when society will no longer be divided into the idle and industrious, when the rule that they who do not work shall not eat will be applied not to paupers only, but impartially to all, when the division of the produce of labor, instead of depending, as in so great a degree it now does, on the action of divert, will be made by concert on an acknowledged principle of justice, and when it will no longer either be or be thought to be impossible for human beings to exert themselves strenuously in procuring benefits which are not exclusively their own, but to be shared with the society they belong to, which is a classic Mill run-on sentence, right? But it's the first part that I really wanted you to pay attention to. So Mill's socialism rejected the kind of economic centralism and authoritarianism that he already foresaw might be practiced in something like the command economies. But he argued, certainly in the later editions of Principles of Political Economy, that capitalists were an indulgence that an efficient economy just really couldn't afford. He said, by and large, they produce a little bit of technical know-how and how to run their firms, but this is nothing that workers, he thought, couldn't actually do for themselves and probably actually do better. In addition to this, Mill said he thought that workplace democracy would be morally uplifting from a liberal standpoint, and for good reasons, right? He said, look, liberals came into the world committed to this idea that there should be no kings, as the phrase goes, that aristocracy was a bad thing, precisely because it induces this attitude of bowing and scraping towards one's betters. And Mill said, there's no reason why we shouldn't extend precisely these same liberal principles into the workplace, because that's what a lot of workers right now are experiencing when they go to work, right? They have to bow and scrape towards their bosses in a way that is morally demeaning. And he thought that governing things for themselves would be uplifting. Okay? So he argued for worker-managed firms where laborers would elect managers to run things and could be recalled. And he argued that profit would be widely shared. This would be accompanied by a widespread redistribution of wealth by the state, ensuring health, education, alleviation for the poor, and more besides. Here, I'm just going to say, read Helen's book. It's really good. And she's a very nice person, too. So if you email her, I'm sure she'd be happy to let you know about that. So my book is largely a retrieval of liberal socialism, which is a fancy academic term to say I don't kind of offer my own arguments for it that expansively, although I do offer some criticisms of the tradition as it stands right now. Although I'm shamelessly willing to say this, I am pitching a new book that'll try to offer my own account of this, right? But I do think that liberal socialism embodies an ideal whose time has come, or at least it's something that we should consider, because it does offer a genuine hope for a better future, free of domination in politics and in the economy, while retaining and in fact deepening in many respects our commitments to core liberal values. And I would also add, from a political theoretical perspective, a lot of extremely exciting work is being done in this vein in the field of liberal theory right now. So it's not just me, right? I already mentioned Elizabeth Anderson's work, which is really pioneering in this regard, particularly her most recent two books. You can look at people like Moyne or McCabe or Igor Shulkitbrod, or Dan Chandler from the London School of Economics, who published a recent best-selling defense of what he calls a left Rawlsian vision, right? Where he also kind of makes very similar arguments to what I'm doing. So I argue liberal socialism is not a monolith. There are a lot of different variations and flavors that it comes in, some of which might be more to some people's taste than others. But it does offer a genuine vision for a future of economic democracy and an end to plutocracy and oligarchy, which is very much in line with the revolutionary goals that liberals held to when they first entered into the world, which was, of course, to create a society committed to liberty, equality, and solidarity for all. And I am not yet ready to sacrifice the aspiration to achieve these principles to the right, which I think is fundamentally committed to a very different set of values, namely what Hayek described in the Constitution of Liberty, which is that the right is committed to this idea that there are recognizable superiors in society, and the best thing for everybody is for us to bow and scrape to our recognizable superiors. I don't think that that's a social vision that I want to see implemented, and I think that liberal socialism is one of the things that can inoculate us against it. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes for some Q&A.
Yeah, I like the jacket, so.
So I had a question. It was kind of in the first half of your lecture regarding the hard right and their stance on, I may have misinterpreted it, but their stance on society should be organized behind certain social groups of, like, you mentioned it's kind of a more conservative Catholicism and something like that, and that might end up cutting off other minority groups. Then you mentioned that those same groups also advocated that post-1980 United States is no longer a democracy as a result. Isn't that kind of hypocritical, saying that, well, these rich elites are in charge, but we don't want them to be, so we want our rich elites to be in charge?
Well, quite a few people have pointed that out about Deneen's book, and his response is by and large been, yeah, but we'll be better elites, right? You know, they're genuinely committed to what ordinary people want, as opposed to the neoliberal elites at their fancy universities who are
But
just.
isn't that what the current elites said 40 years ago?
Sure, right? And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I posit that what we should be doing is moving away from a society that is so oriented by elitism of any sort, right? Precisely because I don't really think there's that much of a transition. But this is a good point for me to kind of talk a little bit more about this, right? So there's been a lot of research done recently into the nature of right-wing thought, right? And certainly when I was growing up, the kind of version of right-wing thought that was largely considered to be canonical was a kind of moderate Burkean conservatism of the sort that you would associate with somebody like George Will, for example, in his book, The Conservative Sensibility, which is to say that, you know, to be a conservative or to be on the right is to endorse prudence, deference to the way things have been done before, and to not want to shake things up in too radical a way, right? It was a slow, cautious steering of the ship. And I want to acknowledge that that is very much is part of the right. And I actually think there are some virtues to things like Burkean conservatism. I don't think change for its own sake is a good thing. But I don't think that that really captures the essence of what being on the right is. I tend to agree with Hayek that being on the right means being committed to this idea that there are recognizably superior people in society, or recognizably superior groups. And these recognizably superior groups are entitled to more of everything, really. More agency, more power, more political influence, certainly more cultural influence, more money. You pick it, right? And if you look at the history of right-wing thought, what becomes very clear is they have different ideas about who is a natural superior, right? The white nationalists have their kind of candidate for who it is, which is anybody with the right skin pigmentation. Different religious nationalists think that Christianity, a certain form of Christianity at least, should be morally elevated over others. Various forms of right-wing libertarianism, as distinguished from, say, bleeding heart libertarianism, think that the Randian capitalists are all little John Galts, and the rest of us are just parasitic takers that want to appropriate from those who've done everything, right? But that's kind of the essence of what they're all committed to, this idea of recognizable superiority. And once one understands this, something like conservative revolutionary theory becomes a lot more easy to understand. So think about somebody like Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, right? Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are very difficult to interpret as figures who are really committed to small c conservatism, right? Reagan used to like to say that Paine was right, that we have it in our power to make the world anew. Doesn't really sound all that conservative, and that's because he really wanted to repudiate the legacy of an excessive form of the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement. Margaret Thatcher used to say that she wanted to change the soul of the nation, right? And economics was just the means, not the end, right? And it's very hard to associate changing the soul of the nation with conservatism, right? Saying that things are just fine, we're going to carry on and keep calm, right? And I think that what we're seeing now is just a more radicalized version of this project, right? There was a good essay that came out by Glenn Elmers back in 2021, Conservatism is No Longer Enough, that captures this very well, where he says the reality is there's nothing left conserved that's worth conserving in this country. Real Americans, by which he means people on the right, aren't in charge any longer. And so we need to get on board with this idea that we're going to launch a counter-revolution and fundamentally change the country. Right? And looking at the history of right-wing thought, that's just really not that surprising. Yeah. Go zigzag.
So a lot of sympathy for what you're proposing at the end,
Thank you.
but I am going to attack this from a left perspective. I'm sure you've probably heard this before.
Mhm.
I'm going to try and not be annoying about it. So talking about liberal socialism, it seems like the problem here is like the maintenance of such an order, right? The idea that like we have these really great goals, and I think there is, you know, a lot in common with, you know, some of the thought of like Mills and Wollstonecraft and all these early theorists, right? But the problem is like we're requiring a very big change in the way that we orient society. We're also alongside of that saying, well, we're going to have this really robust democratic system, right? What stops these actors who have said, you know, we're not worried about, you know, trying to do some sort of kind of revolution when we see things aren't going the right way? What stopped these actors from basically appealing to the lowest common denominator in our thought, in terms of our most base instincts, I guess, to be like, no, this is too hard. To organize society like this is too difficult, and we should just go back to something that's easy, right? I mean, and the biggest issue you're going to come up against is the fact that you're going to have elections every 4 years, 2 years, what have you, right? And it's going to be so easy to be like, well, the project of, you know, collective democracy in the workplace is difficult. We're dealing with market forces outside of the state. Let's just go back to doing the old thing, right? How does liberal socialism defend against that? And I maybe to kind of go off of this, like, doesn't it seem like the more likely way to achieve these goals is to centralize power and not worry about democracy?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important set of questions. So I'm going to break this into two. The first part I'll theorize a bit, and then I'll try to give a practical example, right? Just to kind of ground this a little bit. So in terms of the theory, right, I think that once you understand right-wing thought as this commitment to recognizable superiority on the part of some groups, you can actually understand a lot more easily why it could have a certain kind of populist appeal, right? That might seem contradictory because you think, how can elitism be populist? But think about making a pitch to the public, right? My saying you're the equal of somebody from Mexico or the equal of somebody from sub-Saharan Africa will resonate a lot less with people than my saying, you're actually better than everybody else. This was your country, your world, your culture, and that has been taken away from you. And vote for me, and I'll kick all those unworthy people out, or I'll send them back to the jobs that they belong in, and you will be reconsecrated as the gem that you are, right? For a lot of people, that's going to be a much more convincing pitch than a pitch aimed at equality, right? And I'm not really sure how it is that liberal or left movements can counteract the emotional resonance of that yet. Theoretically, what I can say is that I think that the great Canadian philosopher, I'm Canadian, Charles Taylor is right. In his recent book, Cosmic Connections, what he pointed out is that one of the reasons why progressive thought or left-wing thought is always runs into these difficulties, it is actually more demanding than conservatism. It's a lot more demanding. This is what he calls the kind of axial approach that we need to understand the trajectory of modernity is moving on, right? Where he says, liberalism and all forms of leftism demand that you commit yourself to a kind of universalism that holds that all life is sacred. That's the Dworkin connection, right? And that we need to value each person's life on the planet as equally sacred. That is so demanding an ethic that we have yet to find a society that can properly instantiate it, right? And it's a lot easier for many conservatives to say, like J.D. Vance said, look, we're going to put ourselves first and we're not going to bother with all that. But this kind of leads into a response to your question, because I think that if liberals or leftists are going to respond rhetorically to the right in a way that is theoretically consistent, it needs to be by acknowledging that what we're asking is a more demanding ethic, but by pointing out something that I think a lot of Americans resonate with, which is why shouldn't we challenge ourselves to give in to the better angels of our nature, right? Why accept this kind of low way of approaching politics where the president is going to happily accept a jet from Qatar and people are just going to deal with it because they want to see millions of Mexicans sent back home, even if they happen to be residents here for a long time, right? In terms of how to practically instantiate something like liberal socialism, I'm very overt in the book that I actually don't think that there are any good empirical reference points to make, right? And I think that this isn't just problematic empirically. One of the things that I point out in the book is one of the reasons liberal socialism has never really caught on is it's way too ideal theoretic, right? There's really not been enough attention paid to issues like power, issues like practical politics. Way too much of it exists in Rawlsian and Millsian headspace, right? And I think that if liberal socialism is going to have a shot, it's going to need to accompany what I call a Rawlsian optimism of the will with a lot more Marxist pessimism of the intellect. Now, saying that, I think that there are models that we could potentially look to as examples on how to improve. So I wrote an essay on a good book, Nordic Socialism, for a Damage magazine called Closer to Mars. And what I point out is that what Pele Dragstad calls Nordic socialism has produced the most prosperous societies the world has ever seen. Now, many people are unhappy with certain aspects of this, certainly on the left, and they say, well, it doesn't really go far enough in terms of actually achieving our goals, which is a robust economic democracy. But to the title of my review, what I say is, look, if I had found out that someone had built a rocket ship and that rocket ship had gotten to the moon, and I was trying to build a rocket ship that got to Mars, I wouldn't sit there and say that rocket ship has only gotten to the moon, so I'm not going to learn anything from it. I would say, boy, that's pretty impressive. I'm going to learn as much as I possibly can from it, and then let's see if we can go further, right? So I think if we were to build something like a Nordic-style social democracy in the United States, the way that, say, Bernie Sanders has called for, then that would be a huge step forward. And for those on the left who want to go further still, then I say, let's just get to the moon before we try to get to Mars.
So you referenced Carl Schmitt.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that, like, the way I understand Schmitt saying is that when the power to define rights is located within the nation state, that the manipulation of who is, I guess, like, who can access those rights is always up for debate. I guess, to what extent is it possible, if that is true, to actually achieve this vision at the nation state level alone? Like, is it possible to have this sort of vision without having some sort of universal conception of global democracy?
I would actually say that to fully achieve it, then yeah, we would need to embrace that kind of universalism. But to my point about baby steps, right, I think that that's really unattainable right now. So what you're referring to is Schmitt's argument in a variety of different books, but primarily The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, where he actually insists that equality will always require a certain kind of inequality. It's quite a striking observation where he says, equality can only exist within certain tightly parametered groups, namely the nation state, and being committed to equality within our group is going to mean treating other people unequally. you choose whoever it happens to be that are your enemies, right? Your ideological foes, your theological foes, your national foes, Jews, right? I mean, he was a vigorous anti-Semite, right? I think that, there's a certain amount of truth to this, right? In the sense that it's always been difficult to figure out how far we can expand the horizon of liberal concerns, from a practical, everyday perspective. But where I disagree with Schmidt is that I don't think that it's the case that we just say, well, liberals have to make choices about whose needs they're going to prioritize. So really, they're no different than Nazis, right? In terms of prioritizing the in-group over the out-group. I think there are degrees of concern that you can show to different people, and that should be continuously expanding wherever possible, right? And I think that liberalism and liberal democracy has done a lot better job of showing concern to as many people as possible, compared again to a fascist state. And I don't even know how anybody could question that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so first of all, thank you for being here.
Sure.
And second of all, it seems like you do value to some degree like collectiveness and like this kind of like communal spirit, this idea of civic sense. And my question is, so China has a lot of this, right? Like it's a very collectivist kind of civilization, and most recently, it's kind of opened up and it's embraced a form of like kind of free market capitalism. But there's still like an authoritarian government. There's still like a forced kind of social sense on like rich people in China that they have to take some kind of social responsibility. The problem is that China can be described as a mature fascist economy, and I just wanted to know like what you think of that.
Well, I don't know very much about Chinese politics, right? So I do not want to tread where I don't know very much, right? The most that I can say is, certainly from my standpoint, I think that genuinely being committed to left-wing goals means being committed not just to the economic redistribution of goods towards the poor, but also an emancipatory society where people have a meaningful say in how it is that they're governed. And an authoritarian state structure is just not compatible with that in any way, shape, or form, right? Now, I don't deny that China has done a lot in lifting people out of poverty, right? But I would also emphasize that the tens of millions of people who were killed as a result of something like Maoism makes me very, very hesitant to anywhere close to embracing that model, right? So that's all I can say about that.
Yeah, you referenced the Overton window, I think is what you called it. Could you elaborate on that and how it might explain the rise of Mamdani and Trump-like figures in modern politics?
Sure. I mean, there's been a lot of debate about why American politics has wound up being so weird recently and when it all started going downhill, right? Some people said it's, the civil rights movement. Some people would say it's been going in this direction since the Civil War. So again, you can really pick your point. I would argue that what's occurred, whenever you want to periodize it, has been the delegitimization of hegemonic neoliberal institutions and values. And no one is quite sure what should replace that. And what has stepped in to replace it, quite successfully so far, has been various forms of illiberal rightism. In this country, it goes by the name of Trumpism. It looks like Nigel Farage is going to win in the United Kingdom, so that's another example there. There's Orbanism. Again, you can choose Modiism. You can choose your flavor of this, right? Now, the reason why it is that I think that the illiberal right has been the beneficiary of this delegitimization of neoliberal institutions is precisely that liberals have not listened to what ordinary people want, right? Ordinary people have not been much more clear that they are tired of politicians being unresponsive to their needs. They are deeply unhappy with the fact that they don't live in a genuinely democratic society. And instead what we get are people writing op-eds like the one I saw back in 2016, that it's time for the elites to rise up against the swinish multitude, against the vulgar masses. These were liberal elites, right? We need to push back against these kind of vulgar MAGA figures. And I think until liberals are willing to take a closer look at why it is that our creed has failed, we're going to wind up in the Moines situation, right? Which is it's going to continue to fail. And even where it does survive, it's just not going to be good enough. Any other questions?
Time for one more question.
Yeah, please.
What is the future of the Constitution according to the right wing?
Well, that's a big question, right? In fact, there's a lot of debate about that going on in the right now, right? People like Chris Rufo, for example, who some of you might know was Ron DeSantis's mover and shaker, the architect of the kind of post-secondary reforms there that are intended to be emulated across the country. He's much more committed to what we might call kind of originalism that still pays deference to the founders, but of course interprets the founders' intentions in a way that aligns with right-wing goals. Right now, though, what's really at the kind of cutting edge is Vermeulian common good constitutionalism. Politico did a big op-ed on this not too long ago, pointing out how many young conservative lawyers are quite open-minded to these kinds of Vermeulian visions. So common good constitutionalism by Vermeulen essentially says originalism was always a sham, right? Every conservative knew if they were intelligent enough that we were just using it as a Trojan horse to advance our goals. If they didn't think that that's what we were doing, then they were too stupid to really be part of this movement. That's why I like Vermeulen, right? He's kind of overt about these things. And he says we don't need this Trojan horse any longer, right? We control the court system. We definitely control the Supreme Court. So there's no need to kind of hide behind we're going to be committed to the founders' vision any longer. Let's just enact a conservative vision and use judges as a vehicle for doing so, right? And there's something that's kind of refreshing about the book in that respect, right? Since many of us who've been critical of originalism, we're like, oh, thank God, someone's finally willing to say that on the right, right? But it's also kind of terrifying in the sense that you're like, well, now the gloves are truly off, right? There's not even the veneer being concerned with the liberal or Republican norms that the founders tried to instantiate. So I have wrote a recent book with my former supervisor, who's a good friend of mine, Les Jacobs, Against Post-liberal Courts and Justice. It's about reintroducing Dworkinian thought, right? And what I argue is that in the medium term, what liberals and the left need to do is to develop a theory of constitutional interpretation that has a lot more heft to it than what's been around for a long time, which is a kind of pragmatic, experimentalist approach to constitutional reform, right? The kind of idea being that, society, our interpretation of the Constitution needs to change and evolve as society does, right? I just don't think that's inspiring enough for liberals and leftists to get behind, whereas I think that something like Dworkinianism generally does have a lot of meat to it and can provide a substantial alternative. But I don't want to bore everyone with too much detail about that. That's the kind of medium-term thing that I think we need to do to respond to that.
Okay, I think our time is up. Before we thank our guest, let me remind you our next event in this series is in 2 weeks, November 6th. We have Sam Moyn, and you heard a little introduction to Sam Moyn today, but you'll hear a lot more in 2 weeks. Join me now in thanking Matt McManus for a really interesting